She was starving, wounded, and heavy with unborn pups, collapsed in the snow with no one to hear her cry. But in that silence, one man, broken by grief, heard something louder than a howl, a cry for redemption. And when he chose to save her, he didn't know she'd save him too. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Cascade Mountains, Oregon, winter. The snow had begun to fall before dusk, thick and unrelenting, blanketing the Cascade Range in Oregon with a cold stillness that silenced even the creaking of pines. Temperatures had dropped to near zero, and the biting wind swept down from the peaks like ghostly fingers searching the valleys. In the heart of this vast wilderness, nestled at the edge of a frozen creek and half shrouded by towering Douglas firs, stood a modest log cabin. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, disappearing quickly into the overcast sky. This was the home of Ethan Walker, a 62-year-old retired Army medic, whose weathered hands and steel-gray beard hinted at both hardship and resilience. Ethan had lived alone in the woods for nearly a decade, having moved to the wilderness after the death of his only son, Caleb, in Afghanistan. A tall man with broad shoulders that had once carried battlefield stretchers and now hauled firewood. Ethan's appearance matched the rugged environment he had chosen. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, had grown quieter with time, reflective, deeply shadowed with grief he never voiced. Though he had the steady movements of someone who had survived war and wilderness alike, there was a certain stillness in him, the kind that came from knowing the world could fall apart in a single letter from overseas. The cabin itself was plain but well kept, built by Ethan's own hands. It was fortified against the harsh mountain winters. Solar panels lined one side of the roof, though most power came from firewood and a modest generator. Inside, the main room was warmed by a crackling wood stove, with a simple cot against the far wall, a table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with medical books, old photographs, and canned goods on one shelf. Near a dusty American flag folded into a triangle sat a framed photo of a young man in uniform, Caleb, smiling in desert camouflage. The photo was the only thing Ethan dusted daily. It was the kind of evening Ethan had grown used to. Quiet, cold, predictable. He had just finished chopping wood, his flannel shirt soaked with sweat despite the chill, and was now seated with a tin mug of black coffee. Outside, snow pelted the cabin walls like tapping fingers, persistent and sharp. The storm, the local radio had said, would be the worst in years. And then he heard it. A howl, thin, distant, but distinct. It rose against the wind, mournful and raw. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Wolves weren't uncommon in this part of Oregon, but this cry was different. It was shorter, broken, like a call cut off mid-breath. He set the mug down slowly and walked to the door. Grabbing the powerful flashlight that always hung beside it, opening the door invited a blast of icy air, but he barely noticed. His instincts from the battlefield flared again. Something was wrong out there, pulling on his heavy parka and snow boots. Ethan stepped into the storm, flashlight beam slicing through the night. He didn't speak, didn't call out. Words were useless here, instead. He followed the terrain with a veteran's precision, marking subtle disturbances in the snow, broken twigs, irregular patterns in the wind-blown drifts. For nearly 20 minutes, he moved through the forest, stepping over frozen roots and ducking beneath low-hanging branches, until he spotted something huddled beneath a fallen pine tree, a flash of white, At first, it blended too well with the snow, but the closer he got, the more the shape took form, a wolf. A large one, though severely emaciated, its rib cage visible beneath matted fur. Its coat, though dirtied and tangled, was a striking white beneath the grime. Snowflakes collected on its muzzle and ears, and its breath came in labored clouds. Blood stained the snow around its hind leg, where a crude metal snare had clamped around the joint, the rusted teeth digging deep. The wolf lifted its head weakly as Ethan approached. Its eyes, ice blue and startlingly aware, met his. There was no growl, no snap of teeth, just a quiet, desperate kind of pain. And something else. Acceptance. Ethan knelt down carefully, his voice low and steady like he used to speak to wounded soldiers. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're not going to die here tonight." He opened his emergency pack and pulled out a syringe, ketamine, diluted, just enough to keep the animal calm. As he inched closer, the wolf flinched but didn't resist. With practiced care, Ethan administered the sedative, then set to work releasing the trap. It had no serial number, no legal markings, likely an old, outlawed design used by poachers. The anger burned in Ethan's chest. But he shoved it down. Anger wouldn't keep this animal alive. Once the trap released its cruel grip. Ethan inspected the wound. Deep tissue damage, torn ligaments, early signs of frostbite, not fatal yet, but if left untreated, infection or exposure would finish the job. He noticed, too, the wolf's swollen belly. She was pregnant and not far from giving birth. "Well, sweetheart," he sighed, "you sure picked a hell of a night to need help." He wrapped the leg with gauze and insulated padding, then slid his arms beneath her. She was light, too light for an animal her size, as he lifted her. Her body trembled but did not resist. It took Ethan nearly 30 minutes to return to the cabin through worsening snow, his back straining, breath visible in bursts. Once inside, he laid her near the fire, wrapping her in old blankets and towels. The wolf, still under sedation, didn't stir. Ethan sank into his chair, exhaustion washing over him, but his eyes stayed fixed on the wounded creature before him. He hadn't brought a wild animal into his home in years. He knew the risks, the legal consequences. But as he looked at her again, this snow-colored ghost, heavy with unborn life, he thought of Caleb, of the nights he'd sat by his son's hospital bed when he came home with shrapnel in his shoulder. Ethan's hand on his boy's, praying for healing. Maybe saving this wolf wouldn't change the world. But tonight, in a world full of silence and snow, it was something. The storm had passed, but the cold remained, heavy and unmoving, like breath frozen in time. Ethan Walker stood by the cabin window, holding a chipped enamel mug of black coffee, watching the pale light push through the frost-laced glass. Outside, the forest lay buried in white silence. Inside, it was warmer now, not just from the fire, but from the quiet presence lying beside it. The white wolf, no longer just the wolf, had survived the night. Her breathing had grown more regular, her body no longer convulsing from cold. She lay curled near the stove on a thick wool blanket, her coat clean and drying. Ethan had spent hours tending to her wound, applying salve and fresh bandages, and spooning warm broth into her mouth. The trap had cut deep, but the infection hadn't set in. Yet, he knelt beside her now, touching her gently between the ears. "Hope," he whispered. "That's your name." He didn't say it twice. She didn't need him to. The name settled between them like an agreement, fragile but real. That evening, after making sure Hope was resting, Ethan pulled open a loose floorboard beneath his cot, from within the small hollow. He retrieved a cedar box, its lid worn and familiar. He hadn't touched it in years. Inside were several old letters, all addressed to the same name. June, his wife, his compass, gone 5 winters now. He reached for a clean sheet of paper and began to write in the dim firelight. Dear June, I brought a wolf into our home. I know how that sounds. But she was dying, and she's not just any wolf. There's something in her eyes that says she hasn't given up yet. I think I might know how she feels. He folded the letter, placed it in the box, and slid it back beneath the floorboards. For the first time in a long while, writing didn't feel like talking into emptiness. The days that followed took on a rhythm. Each morning, Ethan checked Hope's leg, cleaned the wound, replaced the bandages. He adjusted the dosage of antibiotics he still had from his medical kit, but beyond the physical damage. It was her state of starvation that worried him most. She had barely eaten the first 2 days, only sniffed at the food he left out. Her ribs showed through her thick coat, her eyes sunken. Ethan prepared a broth using elk bone and rice, mixing it with warm goat milk. He sat close as she lapped at it cautiously, glancing up at him between sips. Slowly, she began to eat again, first in sips, then in steady mouthfuls. As hope grew stronger, something unexpected began to change. She started watching Ethan, really watching, her gaze following him as he moved about the cabin. When he spoke to her in a low, calm voice, she seemed to respond, her ears twitching, head tilting. She allowed him to clean her fur, check her belly, and even rest a hand on her side. It was more than survival instinct. There was trust. Building in quiet increments. Ethan had seen it before. Wounded soldiers in field hospitals who gave their trust not with words, but with silence and stillness. The way Hope held his gaze reminded him of that. He told her things sometimes. Meaningless things. What the weather was like. How low the propane was getting. Memories of Caleb's first snowfall. She didn't answer, but she never looked away. One night, Hope wouldn't touch her food. Instead, she paced, limping but focused, around the hearth, then lay down with labored breathing. Her eyes shut tight, and her muscles rippled beneath her coat. Ethan recognized the signs. His breath caught. It was time. He moved quickly, laying down towels and blankets, keeping the fire burning strong. Hope didn't resist as he settled beside her. She let out a long, low exhale that was part growl, part cry, and her body tightened. The birth was slow and quiet. She labored through the night, never crying out, only breathing in that steady rhythm Ethan now recognized. One by one, the pups arrived, 3 strong, vigorous bundles of fur and squeaks. Ethan didn't interfere, he only watched, ready if needed. But the 4th pup came slower, smaller. Its cry was weak, and it didn't move toward its mother like the others. It trembled, unsteady and thin. Ethan reached out, cupping it gently in his hands. Its coat was the lightest, almost silver against the snow white of Hope's belly. A small, pale dot sat between its ears like a pressed snowflake. He held it close to the fire, letting it warm. Then he placed it near Hope's chest, guiding it toward her body with care. The tiny wolf pup latched weakly, then stilled. Breathing shallow, Ethan whispered, "Snowdrop." Hope's eyes flicked up to meet his. She didn't resist. The snow had started to melt in patches along the south-facing slopes of the forest, where weak winter sunlight filtered through the trees like silver thread through dark velvet. Though it was still bitterly cold. Something in the wind had changed, less harsh, more curious, into Ethan Walker's cabin. The fire burned steadily. its warmth not just in temperature but in the strange kind of life it now supported. Hope rested near the hearth, her eyes half closed, ears flicking occasionally at distant forest sounds. The 4 pups nestled close, but one, Snowdrop, remained slightly apart, curled into a ball of soft silver, smaller than the rest. She had survived the birth, but nursing remained a struggle each time she tried to feed. She was jostled aside by her stronger siblings. Ethan noticed this early on and knew he had to intervene. After boiling a batch of formula in a pot over the stove, goat milk with a careful blend of electrolytes and glucose, he used a dropper to feed her, then graduated to a small bottle wrapped in cloth to simulate warmth. Snowdrop's tiny mouth barely latched at first, her tongue weak, but day by day she grew stronger. Hope watched him each time, her gaze calm, unafraid. It should have been unnatural, a wild wolf letting a man feed her offspring. But there was no tension in her body, only quiet understanding. Sometimes she even nudged Snowdrop gently toward Ethan when the pup grew too tired to fight for milk. Ethan wrote about it all in his letters to June. "She trusts me with her baby. I don't know what to make of that. I remember when Caleb was born, how you refused to let even your own mother hold him without washing her hands first. Hope looks at me like I'm part of the den. I don't deserve that, but I'm not turning away from it." 3 days later, a knock came at the cabin door, sharp. 3 raps, followed by silence. It was the first knock in nearly 4 weeks. Ethan opened the door, blinking at the thin figure bundled in a lavender parka, a knit hat that looked handmade, beneath the oversized scarf. A small face peeked up at him, framed by frizzy brown curls and round glasses fogged from cold. It was Sophie Jennings, 10 years old, the granddaughter of Ethan's nearest neighbor, old Earl Jennings, whose cabin lay 2 miles down the trail. Just past the frozen creek bend, Earl had stopped coming by when the snow got too deep. But Sophie had made a habit of visiting Ethan during the milder weeks to check on the greenhouse, help water the winter sprouts, and ask questions about everything from firewood stacking to moon phases. She was short for her age, with narrow shoulders and a book bag always slung too low on her back. Sophie didn't talk much. When she did, her words came out in hesitant bursts, broken by long pauses and nervous starts. She had a stutter, not from trauma, but from what her teachers called speech delay anxiety. Most kids avoided her. Ethan didn't. "You shouldn't be walking in this weather," he said gruffly, but gently. Sophie shrugged, eyes flicking toward the snow piled beside the cabin. "Grandpa, Sis said I could come if I stuck to the tea trail." Ethan let her in, pulling off her mittens and guiding her to the fire. Her gaze immediately dropped to the bundle of movement beside the hearth. "You've got puppies?" she asked, kneeling carefully. "Wolf pups," Ethan corrected. "Hope's their mother." Sophie froze, wide-eyed, but Hope didn't growl or move. She simply lifted her head and blinked slowly at the child. Sophie stared back, then inched closer. The little one? She's not like the others." "She's Snowdrop," Ethan said. Watching her, "She's a fighter, but she needs a bit more help." Sophie came back the next day, and the next, each time. She sat beside the fire, reading quietly from a worn paperback or humming softly. She rarely spoke at first, but one morning, as Ethan handed her the bottle for Snowdrop, she whispered, "Can I feed her?" Hope didn't move. Ethan nodded. Snowdrop squirmed a little in Sophie's palms, then latched onto the bottle's rubber tip. Sophie smiled, not wide or loud, but something genuine, full of wonder. Her stutter didn't matter then. She was quiet, focused, calm, feeding, Snowdrop became a shared ritual. They'd take turns, Ethan in the mornings, Sophie in the afternoons, and slowly, the girl, who once flinched at conversation, began to murmur to the little wolf pup, "You're gonna grow big," she whispered one afternoon, bigger than your brothers." And Snowdrop would nuzzle into her sleeve like she understood. One day, Sophie brought a small crocheted collar, not to wear, just to place beside Snowdrop's bedding. My mom made it, before she got sick. She said, I never used it. I think Snowdrop should have it. Ethan didn't ask more. He didn't need to. That night, as Hope lay resting and the pups piled against her belly, Ethan opened his notebook and wrote, "Dear June, I think you'd like Sophie. She's quiet like you were when we met. She talks to Snowdrop now. Words come easier with the pup around. Maybe she sees herself in the runt, or maybe Snowdrop just listens the right way. Either way, it's working. By the end of the week." Snowdrop was walking, not fast, not strong, but upright, steady. She still leaned a bit to one side, her back legs slower to respond, but her spirit was unbreakable. Hope watched her progress with calm pride, and Ethan began to believe, for the first time in years, that something was growing here, not just life but healing. The days were growing longer now, light stretching into early evening, and the snow receding into heavy slush around the base of the pines. The forest, though still wrapped in winter's arms, had begun to stir, birds returning to brittle branches, and the occasional echo of distant paws over melting ice. Inside Ethan Walker's cabin, life followed a quieter rhythm, one shaped by new rituals: feeding, watching, writing, tending. Hope's pups had grown more mobile, their small legs finding balance, their growls turning playful. Snowdrop remained smaller, but she moved with a determination that made her siblings give way when she passed. Sophie came nearly every afternoon now, always wrapped in that lavender coat. Her cheeks pink from the walk, her stutter had softened. She spoke more when talking to the wolves, and even to Ethan, especially when he let her carry Snowdrop to the padded corner of the cabin they now called the den. Sophie's words came not in confident sentences but in soft certainties. She's not just small, she'd say. She's listening to everything. Ethan believed her, but something in the air was shifting. He'd noticed it first in Hope, subtle at first, just the way she would lift her head when the wind changed, or how her eyes grew distant at sunset. Then, one morning, while Ethan was chopping wood, he caught her standing by the tree line, motionless, ears forward, body tense. He followed her gaze, but saw nothing. Still, a deep instinct twisted in his gut. That night, after Sophie had gone and the pups were nestled around Hope, Ethan stepped outside with his flashlight and scanned the forest's edge. He didn't hear it at first, just the hush of trees shifting in the cold wind. But then it came, faint but clear. A howl. It was long, layered, too controlled to be random. A second answered, then a third. Ethan's breath caught. Wolves. Not the occasional lone traveler or distant echo he was used to, but a pack, a full one. Close. Hope stood at the cabin door when he returned inside, her body alert but not aggressive, her head tilted toward the window, her breathing shallow. The fire cast her silhouette across the floor as she stood between warmth and wildness. The next evening, the howling returned, closer now, more direct. The pups reacted, ears perked, whimpering. Hope remained still. Ethan sat by the fire, watching her. She turned once to look at him, and he saw it, the pull in her eyes, a knowing, a conflict. Later that night, after he had fallen asleep in his chair. Hope rose and pressed her nose against the window, staring into the trees until dawn. The real moment came 2 nights later. When the pack arrived, Ethan had just finished feeding the pups when Hope let out a low, urgent growl, not at the pups or him, but toward the door. He looked outside and saw them, figures moving between trees, silent as smoke, 8 or 9, all shapes and sizes, with one larger than the rest standing in the center clearing, its yellow eyes catching the cabin light. Hope's body tensed. She paced, then sat by the door, torn between instincts she could no longer ignore. Ethan moved to the door and stepped out, rifle slung on his shoulder, not to shoot, but to warn. He shouted once into the trees, no response. The wolves remained, watching. Then, the larger one took a step forward, from behind. Ethan heard a sound, movement on the stairs. Sophie. She had returned earlier that evening, having convinced her grandfather to let her stay longer and help Ethan overnight. Now, in her wool pajamas and thick socks, she stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide at the sight of the wolves. "Get back inside," Ethan said sharply. Sophie obeyed, but not fast enough. The wolves stirred at the noise. The alpha took another step forward, and then Hope moved. She surged forward through the open door, no hesitation now. She placed herself between Ethan and the pack, her body low, her head lowered in a protective stance. The wolves responded instantly, freezing, their tails straight, ears pricked. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the alpha growled, not loudly, but deeply, a signal. Hope did not retreat. Instead, she let out a growl of her own, not submission, but refusal. Ethan couldn't believe what he was seeing. Hope, the once wounded, starving creature that had trusted him with her life and children, was now choosing. And she had chosen to protect. The pack began to retreat, slow and deliberate. One by one, they vanished into the trees until the clearing was empty again. Ethan turned to Hope. She was breathing heavily, but her gaze was steady. When he knelt, she pressed her forehead against his hand, but the night wasn't over. Sophie hadn't come back inside. Ethan found the door open, panic rising. He called her name once, twice, no answer. He ran out, following small footprints in the snow, barely visible in the dark. His flashlight flicked, battery low. Then a shape rushed past him, white fur, fast and focused. Hope. She moved with purpose, her body weaving between trees, nose close to the ground. Ethan followed as best he could, stumbling over snow-covered roots until he saw them. Sophie, lying half-buried in a drift, coat torn, legs stuck. Her breath was shallow, her eyes wide. Hope stood over her, nudging gently with her nose. Ethan fell to his knees beside them, checked Sophie's pulse, then lifted her into his arms, back at the cabin. He placed her near the fire, wrapped in blankets. Hope circled once, then lay down beside her. Sophie stirred slowly, her lips trembled. She found me. She did, Ethan said. Voice low, she really did. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly. A hesitant guest, melting the snowbanks in slivers and coaxing green from under frozen roots. The pine trees shed their white coats, and the creek, once locked beneath layers of ice, gurgled with life again. Ethan Walker stood on the porch of his cabin, hand resting on the railing, eyes scanning the clearing that had become something far more than a patch of land. It was a sanctuary, a birthplace, and now, perhaps, a place of farewell. Inside. Hope's pups had outgrown the space behind the hearth. They romped through the fenced yard Ethan had built from fallen logs, chasing each other in bursts of joy. Snowdrop, still smaller than her siblings, held her own with a fierce determination, her silver coat now fully fluffed and gleaming in the morning sun. Hope watched them from a nearby patch of wild grass, calm and watchful, her breathing easy. The wound on her hind leg had long since healed, leaving only a faint scar beneath the fur. Ethan had known this day was coming. Over the past few weeks, Hope had taken the pups on longer excursions into the forest and returned later each time. They were learning how to listen, how to stalk, how to disappear into the trees. Wild instincts were asserting themselves again, and Ethan, as much as it pained him, had no intention of stopping it. He spent the night before preparing the wooden gate that opened into the deeper woods. It had been built more to mark the edge of the safe zone than to contain them. This time, when he opened it, he left it wide. That morning, Sophie arrived earlier than usual. Her lavender coat had been replaced by a soft green windbreaker. She had grown taller since winter, and though her curls were still wild, her posture had changed, less hesitant, more open. She smiled when she saw Snowdrop racing toward her, and knelt to receive the small wolf's nuzzle with ease. Ethan had something in his hand, a folded piece of paper, creased at the corners from being read over too many times. "I want you to read something for me," he said. Sophie blinked, then nodded slowly. Her voice had grown stronger over the past months, especially around the wolves. Still, she looked uncertain. "I can try." They stood beneath the old cedar near the gate, Hope and her pups behind them, waiting, watching. Ethan handed her the letter, and Sophie opened it carefully. "Dear June, I didn't think I'd ever feel like a father again, but these pups, they've made me remember what it means to care for something that can leave you. And Hope, she's shown me what trust looks like when it's earned, not asked for. You would have loved her." Sophie paused, took a breath, then continued, her voice clear now, unwavering. "They're ready. June, she's ready. And I think, maybe I am too. I'll miss them. But letting them go is the truest way to honor what they are. Wild, free, beautiful. Thank you for showing me that love and letting go are sometimes the same thing." She stopped, eyes shining. Ethan didn't speak, just placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Hope had moved closer, her pups clustered around her. She stepped forward, nose brushing Sophie's knee, then, without sound, she turned toward the gate, one by one. The pups followed her, bounding through the tall grass, pausing only to glance back at the cabin, at Ethan, at Sophie. Snowdrop was the last. She walked slowly to Ethan, nuzzled his boot, then pressed her small head against his hand. "Go on now," Ethan whispered. "You've got mountains to climb." She turned, light on her paws, and vanished into the trees. The clearing fell silent again, but it wasn't empty. 3 months passed. The forest was thick now with leaves, and birdsong filled the mornings. Ethan resumed his routines, mending tools, tending the garden, checking the creek traps. But something was missing. The cabin was quieter, and the evenings more still. Even Sophie, though she continued to visit, seemed to feel it. Then, one morning at dawn, as mist curled low across the clearing, Ethan stepped out onto the porch and froze. They were there. Hope stood at the edge of the tree line, regal and steady, her white coat glinting in the sun. Behind her, 5 young wolves, nearly grown, flanked her in a loose half-circle. Snowdrop stood in front, her silver fur distinct among her siblings. They didn't approach. They didn't need to. Ethan raised a hand slowly. Hope met his gaze. And then, she did something that made his throat tighten. She bowed her head, A single nod. Then she turned, leading her family back into the woods. Sophie arrived just after the sun rose, breathless from the trail. Ethan was still on the porch, eyes fixed on the trees. "Were they here?" she asked. He nodded. "I missed them. They weren't here to stay, just to let me know they were all right." Sophie smiled softly, her voice steady, like a goodbye, but different. Later that afternoon, Ethan hammered a wooden sign into the ground at the start of the trail. The letters were carved with care, slightly uneven, but clear. Hope's Pines. He stood beside Sophie, wind stirring his flannel shirt. "They'll come back again?" she asked. "Maybe," Ethan said, "but even if they don't, they were here. That's what matters. Sometimes. The greatest miracles aren't thunderous events or parting seas. They are quiet choices. A wounded wolf who chooses to trust. A little girl who finds her voice beside a silent companion. A grieving man who learns to let go, not with pain, but with peace." This story reminds us that God often speaks not through words, but through the stillness of nature, the loyalty of animals, and the warmth of human kindness. Perhaps hope didn't just come in the form of a white wolf, but as a sign that, even in our loneliest winters, we are never truly alone. If you believe that God still works through quiet miracles, through trust, healing, and second chances, comment Amen below. Share this story with someone who may need a reminder that faith, even when whispered, can change everything. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and pray for those who are healing. May God bless every heart that watches this.